A storm rages over an ancient city, thunder rolling like the voice of judgment. In the dim glow of lanterns, a lone figure walks through the marketplace, eyes scanning the faces of merchants and wanderers. Clutched in his hand, a simple pouch of salt. But to those who understand, it is far more than a seasoning. It is power. Salt. We scatter it on our tables, mix it in our food, and walk past it without a thought. Yet beneath its ordinary appearance lies a force older than kingdoms, sharper than swords, and more enduring than stone. What if I told you that salt is more than just a mineral? What if I told you that it holds the power to break curses, seal covenants, and alter destinies? This is not legend. This is divine truth, recorded in the sacred pages of history. Stay with me, and by the end of this journey, you will never see salt the same way again. Sun sets over the vast desert, painting the sky in hues of gold and fire. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense, mingling with the distant bleating of sacrificial lambs. Deep within the stone corridors of the great temple, a priest in flowing robes stands before an altar, his hands steady as he lifts a small weathered pouch. From within, he takes a handful of shimmering white grains, salt. With solemn reverence, he sprinkles it over the offering, the sound barely more than a whisper against the flickering torchlight. From the dawn of civilization, salt has been more than just a mineral. It has been a sacred bridge between the divine and the mortal. It has seasoned the tables of kings and slaves alike, sealed covenants, and marked the hands of the chosen. Yet among all its uses, there is one truth that stands above the rest. Salt is a symbol of purity, preservation, and divine authority. In the ancient laws given to Moses, God did not request salt. He commanded it. Every grain offering, every sacrifice, every sacred act upon the altar was to be seasoned with salt, ensuring that no act of devotion would be offered without it. But why? The priest steps back, watching as the offering burns, the salt crackling in the flames. The smoke rises, curling toward the heavens, as if carrying the prayers of the people with it. In the book of Leviticus, the command is clear. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. This was not a mere ritual, it was a divine instruction. Salt was the mark of permanence, a reminder that what was holy must remain untainted, and what was devoted to God must be preserved from corruption. It was a symbol of God's covenant with his people, a seal that could not be broken. But salt's power does not end at the altar. Its influence stretches beyond the sacred halls of the temple and into the very foundations of life itself. The scene shifts, revealing the bustling streets of an ancient city. Merchants call out their wares, traders haggle over goods, and at the center of it all, piles of salt, gleaming under the sun. Salt was life, it was currency, it was survival. In the ancient world, where food was scarce and preservation was a matter of life and death, salt was the difference between feast and famine. It was the secret that allowed nations to flourish, armies to march, and civilizations to endure. Even the word salary, a payment for one's labor, comes from the Latin salarium, a reference to the salt rations given to Roman soldiers. Without salt, there was no trade. Without salt, there was no economy. Without salt, there was no civilization. The camera shifts again, this time to a desert caravan, the sun beating down as weary travelers press forward. Strapped to their camels are heavy sacks, not of gold, not of spices, but of salt. In the ancient world, salt was more valuable than silver, more precious than gemstones. Wars were fought over it, kingdoms were built upon it, and treaties were sealed with it. To share salt with another was to forge a bond that could not be broken, a covenant that even death could not dissolve. In Eastern traditions, a man who had eaten from the salt of another was bound to loyalty, an unspoken contract of trust and fidelity. To betray one's host after sharing salt was an unforgivable crime. But salt's significance reaches beyond human relationships. It is written that when God established his covenants, he did so with salt. Why? Because salt does not rot. It does not decay. It endures. It is a mark of something everlasting, just as God's promises are eternal. The scene shifts back to the temple, where a young apprentice watches as the priest pours another handful of salt over the offering. His eyes are filled with curiosity, a silent question forming on his lips. "Why salt?" he finally asks. The priest does not look at him but continues his work, his voice steady as he replies, "Because what is pure must remain pure, because what is devoted to God must never be corrupted, because what is sacred must last forever." The flames flicker, the salt crackles, the offering is complete, and so salt became more than a substance. It became a weapon against decay, a weapon against impurity, a weapon against the forces that seek to consume and destroy. The ancients knew this, the prophets knew this, even the enemy knows this. The question is, do we? Of Rome, its golden rays illuminating the grandeur of marble columns and sprawling marketplaces. The streets are alive with the sounds of traders calling out their wares, the clinking of coins, and the rhythmic march of soldiers on patrol. Among them, a centurion stops beside a vendor, his hand outstretched. Not for bread, not for wine, but for something far more valuable. The merchant nods knowingly and places a small leather pouch into the soldier's palm. He unties the string, revealing the glistening white grains inside, salt. In the ancient world, wealth was not only measured in gold, but in salt. Civilizations thrived on it, empires depended on it, and without it, life itself would collapse. Salt was more than a simple seasoning. It was the foundation of commerce, the key to survival. The Romans understood this so well that they built vast trade routes, known as Viae Salariae, to transport this mineral across their territories. Their legions marched under the promise of wages paid in salt, a payment so essential that it gave rise to the very word we use today, salary. A Roman soldier kneels before his commanding officer, a bag of salt placed firmly in his hands. With a nod of approval, the officer moves on, leaving the soldier to examine his payment, the grain slipping through his fingers like precious gems. But the Romans were not the first to recognize salt's significance. The Egyptians too revered it, using it not only to preserve their food, but to prepare their dead for eternity. In the pyramids of Giza, the mummified remains of pharaohs rest, their bodies purified with salt, ensuring that even in death they would not decay. For them, salt was more than a mineral. It was the key to immortality. The scene shifts, revealing the bustling port of an ancient Phoenician city. Ships laden with sacks of salt arrive, their crews eager to trade this white gold for goods from distant lands. Salt was the silent force that shaped history. It determined the rise and fall of civilizations. It dictated the movements of armies, the survival of kingdoms, and the prosperity of nations. It was a treasure fought over, protected and hoarded. But among all who sought its riches, there was one who saw salt not as mere wealth, but as something far greater. The scene changes once more. A quiet hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Jesus stands among his disciples, his voice calm yet commanding, "You are the salt of the earth." His followers listen, their eyes filled with curiosity. What did he mean? Why salt? Why not gold or power or strength? Of all the metaphors he could have chosen, Christ compared his disciples to salt, not to kings, not to conquerors, but to a substance that preserves, purifies, and gives life flavor. He understood what the world often forgot, that salt, though humble, is one of the most powerful forces in existence. Without it, food spoils, bodies weaken, and life loses its savor. In the same way, without faith, without righteousness, without the presence of God, the world itself begins to decay. The disciples murmur among themselves, considering his words. Then Jesus continues, his tone shifting. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. A gust of wind sweeps through the hillside, carrying his words into the hearts of those who listen. Here lies a warning, one that echoes through the ages. Just as salt can preserve, it can also lose its potency. Just as it can strengthen, it can also be cast away. The same mineral that was used to anoint offerings in the temple, to seal sacred covenants, and to purify the dead could, if neglected, become worthless. And so Jesus was not just calling his disciples salt, he was calling them to responsibility, to remain pure, to preserve righteousness, to stand as a barrier against corruption. But salt is only powerful if it is used. A bag of salt left untouched does nothing. A disciple who remains silent, who does not act, who does not live by faith, is as useless as tasteless salt. The scene changes once more. A desolate road, a trail of white grain scattered in the dirt, trampled underfoot by passing travelers. A Christian without faith, a believer without conviction, a life without purpose. This is what it means to lose one's saltiness. And yet, how many today walk this very path? How many have let their faith be diluted, their purpose forgotten, their divine calling wasted? The camera shifts again, back to the Roman marketplace. A merchant scoops up a handful of salt, examining its fine grains. He smirks, then tosses it aside. This salt has lost its worth. It is no longer fit for trade, no longer fit for preservation, no longer fit for anything. It is discarded, swept away like dust in the wind. And so the question remains, are you salt that preserves, or are you salt that has lost its flavor? Except for the rustling of wind through the narrow alleys of an ancient city, a lone figure moves in the darkness, cloaked in shadows, carrying a small pouch in his hands. He reaches the entrance of a house, kneels, and carefully pours a circle of salt around the doorway. His lips move in an inaudible whisper as he completes his ritual and vanishes into the night. Throughout history, salt has been used as a weapon, not only by the righteous, but also by those who seek power through darkness. From the hidden chambers of ancient sorcerers to the whispered incantations of modern occultists, salt has played a role in rituals meant to bind, curse, and control. Why? Because even those who serve darkness understand its spiritual significance. They do not create power. They only twist and corrupt what God has already declared sacred. The scene shifts to a different home, a humble dwelling where an elderly woman kneels beside her bed, holding a small wooden bowl filled with salt. She dips her fingers in and sprinkles it across the threshold of her house, murmuring a quiet prayer. But salt was never meant to serve the enemy. It was given as a divine gift to God's people, a shield against corruption, a tool to cleanse and purify. Those who walk in the light understand this. They know that when consecrated to God, salt does not bring harm but protection. It does not bind in darkness, but rather breaks the chains of evil. While some scatter salt to invoke wickedness, the faithful use it to drive wickedness away. Thunder rumbles in the distance. A temple looms against the night sky, its towering pillars worn by time. Inside, priests perform an ancient rite, their voices rising in song as they cast salt upon the altar, offering it as a symbol of covenant and purification. This is the battle that has been waged since the beginning. Light versus darkness, truth versus deception, purity versus corruption. The enemy has always sought to twist what is sacred, to claim what does not belong to him. This is why many fear salt. They have heard of its misuse. They have seen it in the hands of sorcerers and witches, and they assume it belongs to them. But the truth is this: the enemy has no power to create, only to imitate. If witches use salt to curse, it is only because they recognize the authority it carries. If darkness fears salt, it is because salt was meant to drive darkness away. The scene changes again, this time to a small church on the edge of a village. A pastor stands before his congregation, holding up a jar of pure white salt. His voice is firm, unwavering. "My brothers and sisters, do not be deceived. Salt is not the weapon of the enemy, it is the inheritance of the righteous. It is we, the children of God, who have been given dominion over it. It is we who are called to use it with faith, to purify our homes, our lands, and our lives." The enemy would have us believe that salt belongs to him. He would have us forget that God himself commanded its use in sacrifices, in covenants, in blessings. But today, we take it back. Today, we reclaim what was given to us from the beginning. The congregation murmurs in agreement. Some bow their heads in prayer, while others step forward, hands outstretched to receive their portion of consecrated salt. This is not superstition. This is faith in action. Just as the prophets used oil for anointing, just as Moses used his staff to perform miracles, just as Jesus himself healed with a touch, so too does salt have a purpose in the hands of those who believe. It preserves, it purifies, it protects. The camera lingers on a young woman in the congregation, her expression uncertain. She has seen salt used in dark rituals before. She has been told it is a tool of witches. But as she listens, she begins to understand. The greatest deception the enemy has ever accomplished is convincing the world that what belongs to God is his. But today we expose his lie. Today we declare the truth. Salt is not a curse. It is a blessing. It is not a tool of darkness. It is a weapon of light. A final shift in the scene, a storm raging over a desolate plain, lightning flashes illuminating the ruins of an ancient city. The wind howls through the remains of stone structures, the remnants of a civilization long forgotten. This is what happens when people forget the truth. This is what happens when they allow deception to steal what was meant for them. But for those who remember, for those who hold fast to the covenant, for those who wield salt not in fear, but in faith, there is power. And that power belongs to the children of God. Tension. The Valley of Salt stretches wide under the burning sun, its barren ground a battlefield waiting for war. Two armies stand at the ready, their banners rippling in the wind. On one side, warriors clad in steel, their weapons gleaming. On the other, an overwhelming force. More men, more horses, more power. The odds seem impossible, but in the center of it all, a lone figure kneels, grasping a handful of salt. His lips move in silent prayer, his gaze lifted toward the heavens. In the ancient world, battles were not won by numbers alone. They were won by faith, by divine favor, by those who understood that victory is not always decided by the strength of an army, but by the authority given by God. The Valley of Salt was no ordinary battlefield. It was a place where the faithful triumphed against overwhelming odds, a place where the hand of God moved through warriors who dared to believe. The scene shifts. Centuries earlier, King David stands at the edge of the valley, surveying the enemy before him. His men are weary, outnumbered, uncertain. The enemy forces stretch as far as the eye can see, their chariots cutting through the dust like waves against the shore. David, the man after God's own heart, stood where many had fallen before him. The Arameans, the Edomites, they had power, they had numbers, they had strength. But David had something greater. He knew that the battle was not his to fight alone. He knew that the weapons of this world were nothing compared to the power of obedience. And so, before the battle began, he did something unexpected. He took salt, simple, unassuming, yet filled with divine meaning, and cast it upon the land. The grains slipped through David's fingers, scattering across the dry earth. His generals watch in silence. To some, it may seem like a meaningless act, a superstition. But David knows better. Salt was never just a seasoning. It was a declaration. It was a covenant. It was a weapon. In this act, David was not just preparing for battle. He was claiming the land for God. He was purifying it, sealing his victory before a single sword was drawn. And as history tells us, the impossible happened. The enemy was crushed. The outnumbered became the victorious. The Valley of Salt, once a place of death, became a place of triumph. The battlefield erupts. Soldiers charge forward, swords clashing, arrows slicing through the air. The battle is fierce, but the tide turns in David's favor. His warriors, fueled by faith, fight with unshakable resolve, and by the day's end the enemy is no more. The Valley of Salt is theirs. But this was not the last battle fought here. Centuries later, another king would stand upon this same ground. King Amaziah of Judah, facing an army 10,000 strong, would remember the covenant of Salt, and once again history would repeat itself. The enemy fell, the righteous prevailed, and Salt became the silent witness to yet another victory. The camera shifts to the present. An empty, windswept valley. The echoes of battle are long gone, but the land remembers. The earth, once drenched in blood, now lies still, carrying the weight of what had been. Salt has always been more than a mineral. It has marked covenants, preserved offerings, sealed agreements, and yes, secured victories. In the hands of the faithful, it is a declaration of trust in God's power. In the hands of the enemy, it is a weapon of destruction. And in the heart of battle, it is the difference between triumph and defeat. A new battlefield emerges, a spiritual one. A man stands at the doorway of his home, holding a handful of salt, just as David once did. But his battle is not against soldiers. It is against darkness, against oppression, against the unseen forces that seek to invade his life. He steps forward, scattering the salt along the threshold, his voice steady with conviction. Today, the battlefield is no longer in a valley of ancient kings. It is in our homes, our cities, our hearts. The enemy has not disappeared. He has only changed his tactics. But the weapons of the righteous remain the same: faith, obedience, and the knowledge that what God has declared sacred cannot be stolen. The question is, will we fight? The final image lingers, a grain of salt resting on the ground, glistening in the light, a reminder of the battles won and the ones still to come. For a quiet village, the air is cool, fresh with the scent of morning dew. A father and son stand at the edge of a small field, the rich earth freshly tilled and waiting. The father kneels, taking a small handful of salt from a wooden bowl. His hands are rough, weathered by years of labor, but his movements are deliberate and reverent. He sprinkles the salt over the soil, his lips moving in silent prayer. His son watches, curiosity flickering in his young eyes. "Why do we do this, father?" The man smiles, his gaze still fixed on the earth before him. "Because salt preserves what is good. It keeps the land pure, the harvest abundant. It is not just for food, my son. It is for life itself." From the dawn of time, salt has carried with it a meaning far deeper than most realize. To those who understand, it is not merely a mineral. It is a covenant, a symbol of loyalty, an unbreakable bond. The power of salt is not just in its ability to season or preserve. It is in its ability to seal an agreement that cannot be undone. In the ancient world, it was not ink and parchment that bound a contract, but salt. The scene shifts to a bustling marketplace in an eastern city. Merchants stand beside their goods, spices, silks, and bundles of wheat. In a shaded corner, two men sit across from each other, their faces serious. A deal is being made. The salt covenant was sacred. When two men came to an agreement, they did not simply shake hands or sign a contract. Instead, they took salt, mixed it into their food, and ate it together. To consume salt with another was to enter into a bond that could not be broken. A promise made in salt was eternal. One of the men reaches into a small pouch at his side, taking a pinch of salt and sprinkling it over the meal before them. The other does the same. They eat in silence, sealing their pact. Even thieves, even those who lived by deceit and cunning, honored the salt covenant. To betray a man whose salt you had eaten was an unforgivable crime. It was not merely breaking an agreement, it was breaking faith itself. The camera shifts to a tent in the middle of a vast desert. A lone traveler, weary from his journey, approaches the flickering light of a fire. A figure emerges from the darkness, a Bedouin chieftain, his eyes sharp, his presence commanding. The traveler hesitates, then speaks. "I ask for your hospitality, brother. I have no coin, but I will share in your salt." The chieftain studies him for a long moment, then nods. A servant brings bread, and the traveler watches as the chieftain sprinkles salt upon it before handing him a portion. They eat together. Once a man had shared your salt. He was under your protection. He was family. No harm could come to him under your roof. No betrayal could follow him beyond your walls. Even if he had been your enemy before, from the moment salt touched his lips, he was your brother. Such was the power of this simple, unassuming mineral. Its presence turned strangers into allies, transformed enemies into friends. The camera returns to the present day, to the father and son standing in the field. The father places the empty bowl aside and rises, looking down at his child. "Remember this, my son. A covenant made in salt is eternal. It does not fade with time. It does not crumble with age. Just as the earth will always need the rain, just as the sun will always rise, so too must a promise made in salt be honored." The boy nods, absorbing the lesson in silence. "But what if someone breaks it?" The father exhales, his gaze distant. "Then they do not break the covenant alone. They break themselves against it." The wind stirs the field, rustling the young stalks of wheat. The father turns, walking back toward the house, his son following at his side. And so, for centuries, salt remained a mark of trust, a guarantee of faithfulness. But there was one covenant, one promise made in salt that was greater than any human pact. It was not between merchants or travelers. It was between God and his people. The camera shifts, now to the Temple of Jerusalem, its towering columns gleaming in the midday sun. Priests move through the sacred halls, carrying vessels of salt to the altar. God did not simply suggest the use of salt, he commanded it. Every offering made in his name was to be seasoned with salt, a sign of the everlasting covenant between him and his chosen. As it is written in the book of Numbers, "It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for you and your descendants." The priests sprinkle salt upon the sacrifices, their actions deliberate and unwavering. This was not a mere tradition, it was a declaration, a promise from God that his covenant would never be broken, that his faithfulness would endure through all generations, and yet, over time, men forgot. They abandoned the ways of their forefathers, cast aside the old teachings. The salt covenant, once sacred, became just another ritual. Its meaning faded, lost to those who no longer understood its power. The scene shifts back to the father and son, now inside their home. The father sits at the table, breaking bread and sprinkling salt upon it. He looks at his son and smiles. "Eat, my son, and remember, salt is not just for food, it is for faith, it is for life." The boy takes the bread, tasting the salt upon it. His father watches, nodding with satisfaction. Even today, salt carries the weight of this truth. In the East, in the West, in the hearts of those who still remember, the salt covenant remains. It is a promise that cannot be erased, a bond that cannot be undone. It is a reminder that what is pure must be preserved, what is sacred must be honored, and what is promised must never be forgotten. The final image lingers. The boy, now grown, standing in the same field, his own son at his side. He kneels, takes a handful of salt, and sprinkles it into the soil. The covenant continues. Silent, save for the faint creaking of wooden beams shifting in the cool air. A woman stands alone in her home, her hands trembling as she clutches a small clay bowl filled with salt. Her heart pounds. Shadows linger in the corners of the room, unseen but felt. She exhales sharply, steadies herself, and steps toward the doorway. She dips her fingers into the salt, taking a small pinch and sprinkling it across the threshold. The world is not just flesh and stone, it is spirit and unseen forces. For centuries, those who walk in darkness have understood this, wielding rituals, symbols, and incantations to influence the realms beyond sight. And yet, so many of the faithful forget that they too have been given weapons. Salt, a simple mineral, has long been one of them. The woman whispers a prayer as she moves through her home, casting salt along the windowsills, the doorways, the corners where the light does not reach. Salt has always been a boundary, a line drawn between what is holy and what is not. It was used in sacrifices, in covenants, and in blessings. But it was also used in battle, not against armies of men, but against forces that cannot be seen with the eyes. A gust of wind rattles the shutters. The woman grips the bowl tighter, her voice firm now. The prophets knew this. The early church knew this. But today, so many have forgotten. They allow darkness to creep into their homes, into their lives, believing that prayer alone is enough, while ignoring the physical tools that God has placed before them. The camera shifts to a different home, another time, another place. A weary mother kneels beside her child's bed, her hands resting on the small frame of her sleeping son. He has been plagued by night terrors, his sleep disturbed for weeks. She dips her fingers into a bowl of salt and gently places a pinch beneath the pillow, whispering words of faith. Let no darkness enter, let no curse remain. This house is consecrated to the Lord. She rises, standing in the doorway, watching over her son. The wind outside howls, but inside all is still. This is not superstition, this is faith in action. Just as oil was used to anoint kings and priests, just as staffs became tools of miracles in the hands of God's servants, so too does salt serve a purpose in the physical and spiritual realms alike. The camera shifts again, this time to an old monastery in the mountains. A priest stands before a basin of water, pouring a handful of salt into it before lifting it high in prayer. The monks around him bow their heads, their voices rising in chant. The enemy has deceived many into believing that salt belongs to him, that it is a tool of witches, of sorcery, of darkness. And so, the faithful fear it. They hesitate, they avoid it, forgetting that it was God himself who commanded its use, forgetting that it was his covenant, his symbol, his sacred element before the enemy ever sought to twist its purpose. The priest steps forward, dipping his fingers into the salted water and anointing the doors of the monastery. This house belongs to God. No evil may enter here. The scene shifts back to the woman in her home. She stands now in the center of the room, her salt bowl empty, her heart steady. The weight that once pressed against her chest has lifted. The air feels lighter. The darkness, though unseen, has been driven back. Salt does not belong to the enemy. It belongs to the children of God. It has been placed in our hands, not to be feared, but to be used for blessing, for protection, for war. The camera pulls back, showing the house from the outside. The night remains dark, but something has changed. A boundary has been drawn, a shield has been raised, and inside, where once there was fear, now there is only peace. The question is not whether salt is powerful. The question is, will we use it? Of salt. The storm outside rages on, but inside there is peace. Salt is more than a seasoning. It is more than a relic of the past. It is a tool of power given to us by the Creator himself. It can bless, it can curse, it can heal, it can destroy. But above all, it is a reminder, we are the salt of the earth, and it is time to rise.